lots of developers who said that they're no longer going to use Unity and they're going to use a different engine. Because game development can take years, we're not really going to know how many people have made that switch and what sort of revenue loss that's going to be in the future. So it could be a blip. It may have just been a local minority, or it could be large groups of developers and publishers that have made that move, and we'll only know once we see a different splash screen when those games launch.
Welcome to CGS Shorts, companion talks to the longer format Conversations in Game Studies episodes. About 2 months ago, I caught up with Chris J. Young from the University of Toronto to discuss his institution's trailblazing efforts in video game conservation with the Sid Bolton collection. That talk is already available in both video and podcast format. However, since Chris has extensively studied the relationship between the Canadian independent developer scene and the Unity video game engine, we've also used this opportunity to talk about the turbulent times that Unity has been going through over the past 2 years and where the company may be headed as a result of that. Chris, when we spoke a year and a half ago, Unity was still flying very high, making acquisitions. Its stock price was booming. Of course, since then, the tech sector, or maybe more the video gaming sector, has hit quite a few roadblocks because of overextension during COVID and various other mismanagement incidents, let's call it like that. So could you give a brief update of what has been happening to Unity, which over the past 10 years has grown really into the leading video game engine platform for independent video game makers?
Yeah, when we spoke last, Unity had filed its IPO, I think maybe 12 months or so earlier. It was September 2020 when they filed to go public, and their stock rose. I think it got up to $200 a share, and now it's sitting at around $30. So they rose very high and now it's come back down. But when it rose very high, that gave them an enormous amount of capital to be able to go out and acquire specific companies that they thought would essentially fill in the gaps in the end-to-end pipeline of their platform in terms of creating content. So what I mean by that is when you open up Unity, the idea is that you can make a product, whether it's a game or some sort of other immersive interactive experience, all within that Unity ecosystem. You don't need to go and use another tool to do some task or some aspect of work. That doesn't mean people don't, but that's the ultimate goal that Unity and many of these sort of digital production platforms have. So when we spoke, they were in the midst of this spending spree, all was looking great. I think during the pandemic, lots of these companies had enormous increases in revenue. They also were able to, because this was prior to recent inflation challenges globally, had access to cheap credit. So they were able to not only finance many of these acquisitions themselves, but take out enormous loans at low interest rates to be able to make these purchases. Since then, the world has changed quite a bit again. Interest rates have gone up in order as a strategy to combat what was getting out of control inflation rates. Different degrees in different countries, but overall we saw this as a kind of global trend. And so that has meant companies like Unity and the wider video game sector now are having to deal with costs that they didn't imagine that they were going to have to do. The other side to this, and this is what's a bit more unique to the tech sector in games, is access to virtual technologies to do virtual work or access to digital entertainment like video games skyrocketed. You know, it's not that we had more time to do things, it's that the time we had, we were spending more of it at home because we weren't really able to go out and do other things. So with that, video game companies, Unity, a lot of the tech sector thought that this was sort of a sustainable model going forward. And as it turns out, folks actually do want to go back and go outside and do other kinds of things in their daily routines, or go back to the office and not necessarily entirely work from home. And so those models were not sustainable, or at least they've been proven to be not sustainable. And so now we're seeing mass layoffs across these industries. We're seeing assets being sold off. In the case of Unity, layoffs and a reduction in anticipated revenue has meant that their stock has been devalued because they haven't been reaching the targets that they said they would each quarter. The other side to this, with Unity in particular, is they made all of these acquisitions, but some of these acquisitions will be doing, let's just say, duplicated work. There'll be, human resource departments in all of these companies that they hired. Does it make sense that they have one of those in each of these companies, or is that something that becomes centralized? And this can be the case for other areas of the work of the company and certain departments within the company. So we're also seeing a sort of consolidation effort to bring together different teams to complete certain parts of the work within that platform. So it's a bit messy, and I think they're still approaching the tail end of that process, but that's sort of where they're at. So when the stock went public back in 2020, I thought it was overinflated to begin with. Not that I didn't think the company was valuable and was doing good, but when it was rolling out at $40 to $60 a share, I thought it probably should be a bit lower. And then when it rose to 200, I thought it was getting out of control. And so now where it's sitting at 30 is probably where it is. I mean, of course, the market dictates what something's worth, but I think it's probably closer to what it was worth back in 2020. Now, that being said, they have all of these assets now. Like, they own a number of these important companies in the film industry, in other areas of the tech sector. So I think they're at a point now where they have a platform or a base to grow and to develop other kinds of revenue models to grow as a company.
One of the ways how to combat the underwhelming stock prices was certain measures that they tried to introduce. There was this step that backfired hugely, which was an installation fee, I believe, and that directly went at the bread and butter of Unity.
Yeah, what a PR nightmare that was for them. So they introduced a runtime download activation fee. So what that meant was every time a user of, say, a Unity game downloaded a copy, they would have to pay 20 cents back to Unity. And Unity has very integrated analytics, so I have no doubt that this data would be somewhat accurate. But the challenge with that is that it's presupposing, I think, that these developers are at least selling their games for $1 a download. With freemium business models and so forth, these games are reliant on ads. And ads, they only get the revenue from ads if people play the game, right? Because the ad will appear at certain junctures within gameplay. So if someone's just downloading the game and not playing it, which, many of us do, there's so many games that I've downloaded that I've never really played because I'm thinking I'm going to play it in the future. Suddenly they're on the hook for all of these activations, which they're not generating any revenue from. From a developer standpoint, that is very scary because suddenly you could be legally on the hook for a lot of money, which you're not earning. And so I think there was poor consultation with developers on that, or at least poor understanding of how this might affect large groups of developers within the broader Unity community. It's, a PR nightmare. And I can see where they were coming from, because in the past, they've been very generous with how they negotiate for developers to compensate them for using their tool, because in many ways, Unity is still a sort of free and open developer kit to use. But the approach didn't give enough consideration for those groups of developers who aren't necessarily earning millions and millions of dollars, which is what I think the runtime activation fee was targeting.
You're writing with your colleagues a paper on Unity right now that's about to be published. I'm not sure if you've also looked into how the relationship of game makers and Unity, if it has changed after these events. Do you have any overview at all, if it has impacted somehow the popularity of Unity, or can we ascribe it as one of those unsavory twists and turns of the gaming industry that has been happening all over in the past 2 years?
It's a bit of both, I think. So the first part of the question around, is this going to affect Unity? I think short term, we're not going to see much of an impact. So there were lots of developers who said that they're no longer going to use Unity and they're going to use a different engine. Because game development can take years, we're not really going to know how many people have made that switch. and what sort of revenue loss that's going to be in the future. So it could be a blip. It may have just been a vocal minority, or it could be large groups of developers and publishers that have made that move. And we'll only know once we see a different splash screen when those games launch. And then also when we see Unity's quarterly reports to their stockholders. To me, I think 2 years at the earliest, but probably 3 to 5 years is when we'll really kind of see that drop, especially amongst game developers. To the second part, I do think Unity was caught in an awkward transition during a very unique moment in global history, a pandemic being a sort of once in a generation or a multi-generational event, and launching their company during that pandemic, and then doing a rapid expansion at a time that was perceived to be sort of the way of how things were going to be, and it turning out not to be that case. So I think long term, they will be stable, but I think they need to do a better job communicating the value of their company to stockholders, to potential stockholders, and also to communities, because I think our research with my colleagues, David Nieborg and Dan Joseph, we know what they do because we did the research. We understand what they're trying to do in terms of being the go-to platform for real-time immersive content. But the vast majority of the public just think of it as a game engine. And that's not all it is anymore. So I think they need to figure out either, are they going to double down on just being a game engine, or are they going to become something else, like a creative suite, like Adobe Cloud? Or are they going to be the Office suite like Microsoft is? Microsoft still does all these other things, like being a very large game publisher, but most people know exactly what Microsoft is and what it started off as a software suite of Office tools. So I think Unity just has to figure out what it's going to be, like what is its bread and butter going to be with developers, with consumers, even if they do decide to do some of these other things, or are these other things the core business?
Yes, thank you. That was a much more nuanced take than just either pro Unity or pro developer bashing the company. It's going to be interesting to see how they rise to the challenge. It's not the only video game engine manufacturing company that would have a similar dilemma. I think Epic is in very similar waters, or treading very similar waters with Unreal. Mm-hmm. Since you're in this topic, I think you're going to have your work cut out for you, because especially with AI and with every single bigger platform trying to be a catch-all platform, there's going to be so much disruption and probably also so many nasty stories like the ones that we spoke about.
Yeah, there's lots of big changes on the horizon, and I'm afraid none of us have a crystal ball. So we just have to make the best judgments in the moments as they happen, I think. I haven't used any of the sort of AI integrated features that some of these tools are integrating and using. I've seen it with, say, Adobe Photoshop. That will be interesting to see how that's going to change work, and if the Unity can potentially be this sort of app killer in the sense of like making Unity distinctive from Unreal and vice versa. I think this space is very much open to any of these companies to be able to find a way to differentiate themselves and optimize workflows for their clients, which are developers. So it'll be interesting to see how that shift happens in the coming months, even potentially as new updates roll out.
That concludes our conversation on Unity's present and near future with Chris J. Young. If you would like to find out more about Chris's research, you can do so via the University of Toronto website or Google Scholar, and you can also check out episodes 2 and 7 of this series. Thank you for listening, and until next time.